Some stories are written in lightning. They're loud, they're violent, and they burn themselves into the public consciousness forever. The story of the Stooges is one of those tales. It's a story of primal noise, of shattered glass and peanut butter, of a frontman who was more of a human hurricane than a singer. It's the story of punk rock, born in the dirty industrial heart of the American Midwest, long before anyone knew what to call it. But what about the stories that are written in whispers? What about the figures who stand on the edge of the photograph? The ones who help lay the foundation and then vanish before the walls go up. Every legendary band has its ghosts, its lost members, its tragic footnotes. And for the Stooges, that ghost has a name, Dave Alexander. He was a founder, a creator, the man who wrote some of their most iconic hypnotic riffs. He was there at the very beginning, a high school dropout who, alongside his friends, decided to plug in and unleash a sound the world was not ready for. And then, at the very peak of their chaotic power, he was gone, fired in front of thousands, cast out of his own band and left to fade into a history that almost completely forgot him. He would be dead before he turned 28. This isn't just the story of a rock and roll casualty. It's a story about the devastating fragility of genius, the quiet tragedy of being erased from your own legacy in the fight, decades later, to put a ghost back into the machine. This is the untold story of Dave Zander Alexander. To understand the Stooges, you have to forget everything you think you know about the 1960s. This story doesn't start in the sun-drenched flower power world of San Francisco or the hip swinging streets of London. It begins in the cold, gray, working-class reality of Ann Arbor and Detroit, Michigan. This was the Rust Belt, a place of factories, of deadlines, of cars and concrete. It was a place where the American dream felt less like a promise and more like a threat. But Ann Arbor was also a university town, a weird pressure cooker where blue-collar grit collided with radical intellectualism. While hippies on the West Coast were singing about peace and love, Michigan was home to the MC5, a band that sounded like a political rally set to the tune of a jet engine, and their fiery manager John Sinclair, who founded the White Panther Party, a far-left anti-racist collective that declared its mission was to fight for rock and roll, dope, and fucking in the streets. This was the world that created the Stooges. It wasn't about escapism. It was about confrontation. It was about channeling the boredom, the frustration, and the raw, nervous energy of their environment into something new, into a sound that was minimalist, brutal, and profoundly human. At the center of this burgeoning scene were four young men. There was the preternaturally wild frontman, James Osterberg, soon to be reborn as Iggy Pop. And there were the Asheton brothers, Ron and Scott, a tough, tight-knit pair who brought a street-level intensity to everything they did. Ron would become the band's guitarist, wielding his instrument like a weapon, and Scott would be the powerhouse drummer, the relentless engine of the band. And then there was their friend, Dave Alexander. Born in 1947, Dave was by all accounts different from the others. Where Iggy was pure id and the Ashetons were pure muscle, Dave was the thinker. He was well-read, quiet, and introspective. He and Iggy had been friends at Tappan Junior High and later Ann Arbor High School. They were kindred spirits in their alienation. In a moment that would change music history, a 19-year-old Iggy Pop and a 20-year-old Dave Alexander both decided to drop out of high school on the very same day. They were done with conformity. They were going to start a band. There was just one small problem. Dave Alexander didn't play an instrument, not a single one. The early days of the band, then called the Psychedelic Stooges, were an exercise in pure, unadulterated experimentation. They weren't musicians in the traditional sense. They were artists exploring sound. Iggy would play a vacuum cleaner. They built a drum kit out of 55-gallon oil drums. They were trying to find a noise that matched the feeling in their heads. In this chaos, a decision was made. Dave, the intellectual, the quiet one, would be the bassist. Ron Ashton, in later interviews, recalled the moment with a laugh. Iggy simply declared, "You're going to play bass." Dave's response, "But I don't know how." It didn't matter. He went out and bought a 1965 Fender Precision bass and an amplifier, and he began to teach himself. This is a detail that is so often overlooked, but it is absolutely crucial to understanding both Dave and the band. He wasn't some seasoned pro brought in to hold down the low end. He was a co-conspirator learning his weapon of choice on the job right alongside his friends. His bass playing, therefore, wasn't born from studying scales or music theory. It was born from instinct. It was simple, repetitive, and hypnotic. It was the perfect dark anchor for Ron Asheton's snarling guitar riffs and Iggy's primal screams. He wasn't just playing notes, he was creating a foundation of dread, a feeling of being pulled into a trance. The four of them moved into a communal farmhouse, a place that became known as the Fun House. It was here that they honed their sound, living and breathing the music, fueled by cheap food, cheap drugs, and a shared vision. Dave, despite his inexperience, quickly became a vital creative force. While Iggy was the lyricist and conceptualist, and Ron was the master of the killer riff, Dave was the arranger. He had a knack for structure and dynamics. Listen to the first Stooges album, released in 1969. On the epic haunting track We Will Fall, a 10-minute dirge that sounds more like a strange cult ritual than a rock song, it was Dave who arranged the piece. It was his idea to bring in a viola player and to chant the phrase "another day" over and over, creating a sense of impending doom. He was also the primary composer of the lurching, menacing Little Doll. He wasn't just the bassist, he was an architect of their soundscape. By the time they went into the studio in 1970 to record their masterpiece, Fun House, Dave's contributions had become even more significant. The album was designed to capture the raw, unhinged energy of their live show. The band set up in the studio exactly as they did on stage, with Iggy using a handheld mic and singing live with the tracks. The result is one of the most visceral and intense rock records ever made, and at its heart are two of Dave Alexander's greatest contributions. He wrote the main descending riff for Dirt, a slow, sleazy grind that feels like sinking into quicksand. And most famously, he came up with the driving, unforgettable riff for 1970 I Feel All Right, a proto-punk anthem that distilled all of the band's power into 2.5 minutes of pure adrenaline. Dave Alexander wasn't just keeping up anymore, he was a bona fide creator, a key ingredient in one of the most important bands in the world. He had found his voice, but even as he was helping to build this monumental thing, a darkness was growing inside him, a darkness that would ultimately tear it all down. The Stooges' lifestyle was never sustainable. It was built on chaos, confrontation, and a prodigious intake of drugs and alcohol. For someone like Iggy, this persona was a form of armor, a way to channel his anxieties into performance art. For the Asheton brothers, their bond and their tough upbringing provided a certain resilience. But for Dave, the quiet thinker, the sensitive soul in a band of brawlers, the lifestyle began to eat away at him. He was a heavy drinker from early on. No one is entirely sure where it came from, whether it was a genetic predisposition, a way to cope with deep-seated insecurity, or simply the path of least resistance in an environment soaked in booze. Ron Asheton, who remained Dave's staunchest defender, long after his death always spoke about this contradiction. He'd say that Dave was one of the smartest people he'd ever met, a guy you could have deep philosophical conversations with for hours. But then the alcohol would take over, and a different person would emerge, unreliable, lost, and self-destructive. As the band's notoriety grew, so did the pressure. The Stooges were not a commercial success. Their records didn't sell, and many critics at the time dismissed them as talentless noise. They were adored by a small, fervent cult of fans, but were largely met with confusion or outright hostility from the mainstream. For Dave, who was already on shaky ground, this lack of validation was crippling. He poured his creative soul into these albums, only to see them ignored. His drinking escalated from a problem into a full-blown crisis. He started missing rehearsals. When he did show up, he was often too drunk to play properly. The other members, caught in their own spirals, were frustrated. The camaraderie of the Funhouse days began to fray. They were no longer four friends against the world. They were four individuals struggling to hold on. The breaking point when it came was swift, public, and utterly brutal. On August 8, 1970, the Stooges were booked to play the Goose Lake International Music Festival. This was a huge event, Michigan's answer to Woodstock, with a massive crowd of over 200,000 people. It was supposed to be a triumphant homecoming, a moment for the band to prove their power on the biggest stage of their career. For Dave Alexander, it would be his final performance with the band he helped create. Eyewitness accounts from that day paint a harrowing picture. Before the show, Dave was allegedly in a state of extreme intoxication, possibly having consumed a cocktail of alcohol and psychedelics. He was nervous, disoriented. When the time came to go on stage, he walked out into the blinding lights, looked out at the endless sea of faces, picked up his bass, and froze. He couldn't play. He couldn't remember the songs. He just stood there, paralyzed, as Ron, Scott, and Iggy launched into their set. The band tried to cover for him, their powerful noise attempting to fill the void where the bass should have been. But the absence was deafening. Ron Asheton would later recall looking over at his friend, seeing the panic and confusion in his eyes, and feeling his own heart sink. Iggy Pop, however, was not feeling sympathetic. He was a performer. His entire career was built on a do-or-die mentality, and on that stage in front of that massive crowd, his bassist was dying. The humiliation was immense. As soon as they walked off stage, Iggy fired him. There was no discussion, no second chance. It was over. Dave Alexander, the founding bassist of the Stooges, was out. He was 23 years old. The firing of Dave Alexander is one of the great what-ifs in rock history. From a purely professional standpoint, Iggy's decision is understandable. A band is a machine, and if a critical part breaks down during the most important show of your life, you replace it. The Stooges were a volatile entity at the best of times, and carrying a member who was no longer functional was, in Iggy's mind, a death sentence for the band. But from a human perspective, it was a profound tragedy. These weren't just colleagues, they were childhood friends. They had dropped out of school together, starved together, created together. Firing Dave wasn't just a business decision, it was an act of banishment. He was cast out of the only family he really had, rejected by his brothers in arms, in the most public and humiliating way possible. For the Stooges, the consequences were immediate. They quickly recruited a new bassist, Zeke Zettner, and later Jimmy Recca. But the original chemistry was gone. The magic that existed between the four founders, that volatile mix of intellect, instinct, and aggression, was broken. The band would limp on for a while, recording the album Raw Power with a different lineup before collapsing completely in 1974 under the weight of drug addiction and industry indifference. The Funhouse era, the era of the original Stooges, had ended the moment Dave Alexander was kicked off that stage. But what about Dave? What happens to a 23-year-old whose entire identity is stripped away overnight? This is the truly untold part of his story. History has a way of moving on, of focusing on the survivors. But for Dave, there was no next chapter. There was only the aftermath. He returned to Ann Arbor, a ghost in his own hometown. He was the guy who used to be in the Stooges. He reportedly made a few attempts to get back into music, but nothing stuck. The fire seemed to have gone out. Stripped of his purpose and his tribe, he turned to the one thing that had been with him all along, the bottle. His drinking, which had already been catastrophic, now became his entire existence. There are precious few accounts of his life between 1970 and 1975. He became a recluse, the vibrant, philosophical young man that Ron Asheton so admired disappeared, submerged beneath a tide of alcohol. He was a man adrift, haunted by what he had lost. While Iggy Pop would go on to have a legendary solo career, and the Stooges' reputation would grow posthumously into one of rock's most enduring legends, Dave Alexander was simply fading. In February of 1975, Dave was admitted to a hospital in Ann Arbor. Years of chronic, heavy drinking had taken their inevitable toll. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis, a brutal and painful inflammation of the pancreas directly linked to alcohol abuse. His body, at the age of just 27, was giving up. He developed pulmonary edema, his lungs filled with fluid. On February 10, 1975, David Michael Alexander died. His death went largely unnoticed by the wider world. He became another sad statistic, another casualty of rock and roll excess. He became a member of the infamous 27 Club, alongside luminaries like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison. But unlike them, he was an anonymous member. His death wasn't a global headline, it was a local tragedy. A quiet, lonely end for a man who had helped create such a magnificent noise. For decades, that was where the story ended. Dave Alexander was a footnote. He was the original bassist, the one who got kicked out. In many histories of the band, his creative contributions were downplayed or credited to others. He was the ghost in the machine, his presence felt, but his name rarely spoken. The world remembered the chaos of Iggy Pop, the power of the Ashetons, and the legend of the Stooges, but it had forgotten one of its chief architects. But a legacy like a great riff can be resilient. It can lie dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to be played again. Ron Asheton, until his own death in 2009, never stopped talking about his friend. In interviews, whenever he was asked about the early days, he would make a point to bring up Dave. He would correct interviewers who understated Dave's role. He would tell them, no, Dave wrote that. Dirt, 1970. That was Zander. He fought to keep his friend's memory alive to ensure that the true story was told. He knew that without Dave Alexander, the sound that made them famous might never have existed. The ultimate moment of public redemption, however, would come from the most unlikely of sources, the very man who had fired him. In 2003, the Stooges reunited. With Mike Watt capably filling the bass slot, they began to tour the world, finally receiving the widespread adoration and respect that had eluded them in their youth. And then, in 2010, the call finally came. The Stooges were to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. On the night of the ceremony, Iggy Pop, older, wiser, and more reflective, took the stage. He gave a typically chaotic and hilarious speech, but then his tone shifted. He began to name the people who made it all possible. He thanked the Asheton brothers, and then he looked out at the audience and he said the name that had been relegated to the shadows for 40 years. He spoke about Dave Alexander. He didn't dwell on the tragedy or the drinking. He focused on the creation. He said, and this is a direct quote from that night, Dave Alexander, who had a lot of problems in his life, but he was the one who wrote the great riff to 1970. In that moment, in front of the entire music industry, Iggy Pop gave Dave his credit back. He acknowledged the ghost. He made him visible again. It was a gesture of immense grace, a final settling of an old and painful debt. It came 35 years too late for Dave to hear it, but for those who knew the story, it was everything. So why does the story of Dave Alexander still matter? Why should we care about this forgotten bassist from a band that burned out over half a century ago? Because his story is more than a rock and roll cliche. It's a profoundly human cautionary tale. It shows us how close genius and self-destruction can live, how the very sensitivity that allows someone to create something beautiful can also be the source of their undoing. Dave Alexander wasn't just a drunk who got fired. He was a brilliant, fragile artist who contributed something essential to our culture and was consumed by the very lifestyle that his art depicted. His legacy isn't just in the tragedy, it's in the music. It's in the thudding, hypnotic bass line of Dirt. It's in the electrifying pulse of 1970. It's in the DNA of every punk, post-punk, and alternative rock band that followed. His minimalist, powerful style became a blueprint for a new kind of rhythm, proving that you don't need technical wizardry to move souls. You just need to find the right, honest note and hit it over and over again until the walls shake. The story of Dave Alexander forces us to look closer at the art we love, to see the people behind the legends. It reminds us that for every icon bathed in the spotlight, there's often a ghost standing in the shadows, a forgotten collaborator whose contribution was no less vital. He was the quiet foundation upon which one of rock's most ferocious houses was built. And while he may have been lost in the noise for a time, today, if we listen closely, we can still hear him, and he sounds all right.